Plenty of room up front. I'm Emily Isaacs, and I'm watching the participant list grow. And I know it's going to continue growing, so I'm going to wait a minute before I give a proper hello. But it's fun watching the participant list grow with my colleagues here from Montclair State and beyond. We'll start in just a minute. Welcome. Nice to see everybody. You're here at Montclair State University, live. I'll go ahead and say my name again. I'm Emily Isaacs. I am a professor at Montclair State University. I've been here for some 25 years. I'm a professor of writing studies, and I'm lucky to be the executive director of the Office for Faculty Advancement. I'm very pleased to welcome you to a virtual dialogue, Race and Justice in America, Unpacking Police Violence, Mass Incarceration, and the Courts. It's a pleasure to be here representing the Office for Faculty Advancement, which is one of three sponsors of this event, the Department of Justice Studies at Montclair State, and the College of Humanities and Social Science Committee on Diversity and Inclusion. We are here brought together by Dr. Jason Williams of the Justice Studies Department, who is the organizer, sponsor, and inspiration for this event. The Office for Faculty Advancement seeks to support faculty at Montclair State University in all ways. Obviously, in the last couple of months, it's mostly about teaching in a pandemic, but we're very happy with this event to come back to the life of the university faculty and our commitment to knowledge, to truth, and to enlightenment. And that work isn't something that we're always able to do, but when people bring us forward to do it, I'm ever grateful. So thank you very much to Jason Williams. I want to introduce my two colleagues from Montclair State, besides Jason, Dr. Johnny Lorenz and Chris Salvatore, so they can make a few remarks before we get started with our panel.
Thank you, Dr. Isaacs. Good evening, everyone. My name is Christopher Salvatore, and I am an associate professor and chairperson of the Department of Justice Studies here at Montclair State. I am also a member of the Working Group for Equity and Inclusion in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. And I would like to personally welcome the esteemed members of the panel. These experts are doing work that changes policy and practice and will hopefully bring about lasting change in the criminal justice system and our society. In my own work, I have examined the role of race in sentencing decisions and public perceptions of the criminal justice system. And I have found time and again that race plays a critical role in the criminal justice process. As many of you probably already know, there are over 2.3 million people incarcerated in the United States, a large number of whom are racial minorities. From disproportionate rates of arrest and sentencing to the countless cases of wrongful conviction and police misconduct and brutality, we've seen time and again the need for awareness, change, and reform to address institutionalized disparities in the criminal justice system based on race. Scholars, activists, and movements like Black Lives Matter are crucial in bringing about a criminal justice system which operates in a legal, ethically appropriate, and non-discriminatory manner. And it's my hope that as scholars and educators helping to inform the public, practitioners, policymakers, and the young people of our state, that the Department of Justice Studies will also be a part of the solution to these challenges. So I want to thank everyone for their attention, and especially to my colleague, Dr. Williams, for providing me an opportunity to speak at this important event. Thank you, everyone.
Should I say hello? No? Good evening, I'm Johnny Lorenz, professor of English at Montclair State. I'm also a member of the Latinx Caucus and a co-chair, along with Professor Maisa Taha, of the Working Group for Equity and Inclusion here in the College of Humanities and Social Sciences. Jason Williams, our moderator for tonight, is a vital member of our working group, and we're very excited about this panel discussion on race and justice in America. I'd like to say something about having been summoned to Newark for jury duty a little while ago. And there was only one question that I was asked during the interview for potential jurists, which was the following question. Do you think that the criminal justice system is racist? That was the question I was asked. Well, I was quickly dismissed from the room and sent home. One of the gifts of the Black Lives Matter movement, I think, has been its stubborn insistence in reminding us that the language we've been using to talk about racism is not sufficient. The very formation of our working group was inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement. While much of our discussion tonight of structural racism will focus on policing and the criminal justice system, it's worth noting here that Black Lives Matter has touched all of our disciplines across the college, all of our areas of study. As a professor of poetry, for example, I've seen how poets today, poets like Dennis Smith, Ross Gay, and the former US Poet Laureate Tracy K. Smith are producing important work that is informed in a profound way by Black Lives Matter. In my poetry writing classes, my students and I have been working with ancient rhyming traditions by studying contemporary hip hop artists like Lauryn Hill and Lupe Fiasco. And one can't help but notice how these artists, America's most important rhymers today, keep returning to the theme of structural racism. Whether we're talking about Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five in the early 1980s, or Megan Thee Stallion today. Again, thank you, Jason, and thank you to our panelists for this urgent discussion of race and justice.
Great. So, thank you so much. Thank you to my colleagues, Chris, Emily, and Johnny for such warming remarks. Thank you so much. And thanks to your entities as well for co-sponsorship for this event. Thank you so much. And again, as I mentioned earlier, Chris and Johnny will be leaving the main screen, but they won't be leaving the program. They will be logging back on under their regular logins, such as all of you attendees who are watching us right now. And we're doing this to sort of minimize space on the webinar screen. So if you see them disappear, that's not them leaving us per se. Later in the discussion, we will move to a Q&A period where Emily, who you met, will help us to moderate questions. And you should feel free to ask your questions down below. You should see a Q&A feature down below in the webinar feature here. And you should feel free to type your questions throughout the webinar, from start to finish. Emily will help us to keep tab on these questions. And of course, while we cannot guarantee that we'll get to each and every one of your questions, we will try our hardest to condense and to answer as many as we possibly can. So we apologize in advance. Now, and continuing to give thanks, of course, I'd like to thank you, all of those who are in attendance. And I certainly do this on behalf of my fellow panelists for being here. We thank you for being here with us as we engage in a most pressing topic in today's body politic and throughout social and racial justice activism. We all have been paying attention to the news as well as what might be happening outside our very doors. And as the title exclaims, we are here together tonight for a dialogue, Race and Justice in America, Unpacking Police Violence, Mass Incarceration, and the Courts. And of course, as we know, with the 2020 election right around the corner, in our very last presidential debate tonight, 30 minutes after our discussion here, issues within the administration of justice have become more salient and vicious, given the atrocities of this past summer, surrounding those police-involved deaths of George Floyd, Tony McDade, Breonna Taylor, and so many others. And I should state here that we not only focus our discourses on those who are no longer here with us, but that we also include people who are still living and breathing, right? Because the traumas of excessive police force on bodies who are still alive are traumas that are longstanding. So let's bear that in mind as well. Nevertheless, the heightened visibility of these issues has forced elected officials to respond, as we write in the flyer. Yet their responses are highly contentious and in some cases incomplete. Meanwhile, activists continue to exclaim, nevertheless, that Black lives matter and that more needs to be done to address race. How does race materializes within the criminal legal system? Public discourses are disproportionately void of historical contextualization that typically amounts to a wholesale miseducation of the masses around issues such as race, and again, its materiality within the administration of justice. And this is most unfortunate. And so while some spectators continue to debate the viability of Black Lives Matter and therefore the overall Black experience in America, and I should state parenthetically, as if the Black body exists in an imaginative storyline without the capacity to feel, both the historical and contemporary records have stood very clear, very, very clear. For instance, African Americans have had to face the horrors of slavery. They've had to, from the nation's founding up until about 1865. But we also have to include Juneteenth for those African Americans who remain captive after the Emancipation Proclamation. After having been freed, African Americans have had to endure the vicious white supremacist construction known as the Black Codes, later followed by Jim Crow laws, which was designed to hold any upward mobility that Blacks sought to achieve in their newfound freedom, or so they thought. During this era, Blacks faced the constant prospect of lynching and the complicity of law enforcement in these ceremonial terrors, as Ida B. Wells contextualized them. Officers were often involved in these lynchings, and in many instances refused to investigate them. And so here we have our first instance, if you will, of the under-policing of Black bodies, something that we see today in many urban districts or Black communities. During this era, we saw the rise of the convict leasing system, our very first stab at the privatization of prisons, as well as the commodification of human flesh for profit. And of course, Black folks were the targets here. And what this did was it often reintroduced Blacks right on back to the very plantations from which they were just freed, right? So the horrors of the sort of historicity of the brutality that Blacks often have to experience within the administration of justice. Now, the 80s, to move forward a bit here, brought with it its own sort of racially charged criminal justice policies that decimated urban communities. And instead of cultivating policy that could forthrightly respond to poverty and the basic necessities of the mostly impoverished communities of color that these issues targeted and affected, legislators responded through reactive policies that sought to control the problem. So the war on drugs, for instance, did not rid communities of addiction, nor did it consider the roots of addiction. Instead, what it did was it criminalized and racialized the problem and served a purpose of, once again, annexing Blacks from mainstream society and into our nation's prisons. Anti-poverty laws. They began to receive credence through the ravaging of the social safety net. Poor people in public housing. I lived in public housing most of my life. Those receiving food stamps and etc. Well, they found themselves operating in amazingly punitive confines. I often liken it to open air prisons. I can remember living in public housing as a youth and learning about the new zero tolerance policies that came about in the 90s, which terrified many of us. I mean, imagine as a youth living in public housing and just being terrified at the prospect of being evicted as a youth and not necessarily having a clue as to why people were being evicted left and right. But this policy, it was and is still sadly the impetus behind many evictions that occurs in public housing. And again, public housing being a policy being a construction that was built to care for the poor and to cultivate a sense of civility for our society. But let's think about this. Let's think about this for a second. Many of the people who were evicted, well, they were intergenerationally and multidimensionally impoverished as a result of institutional structures and barriers. So in other words, these people, much like my family who lived there, we absolutely needed public housing and the resources that came along with it. So where are they going to go now? To put it short, these are the kinds of policies that lawmakers created that ended up sort of cultivating the very same social problems that they thought they were preventing. Some of those problems, of course, being homelessness, addiction, crime, unemployment, broken families, additional kinds of insecurities such as food or medicinal and so forth and so on. So what we must understand here tonight, hopefully moving forward through this discussion, is how these processes served as systems of social control or policing that were used to keep African Americans in their place. And not only African Americans, but other racial minorities as well. How they served to ensure a status of caste, and how the institution of policing in particular was a reliable tool at the hands of the state that played a major role in the upkeeping of the status quo. The upkeeping, again, of the status quo, particularly around these legal codes that were created. And these negative experiences, of course, would later follow Blacks in particular into our nation's courtrooms, where they would face racism and microaggressions from prosecutors, their very own attorneys, but also from judges and juries. And indeed, these experiences would follow into the arena of corrections. Thus, it is through this historical record that we begin to see the who, what, when, where, and why of that tumultuous relationship between African Americans and the criminal legal system. Justice for African Americans has often been experienced through the fill-in and shadows of centuries-old anti-Black codes and earth-shattering pain. And it is important to understand how that pain matriculates, because it doesn't just stay with the targeted person. These individuals, the targeted person that is, well, they have family members who are also affected, and particularly children whose lives are forever altered in unimaginably and measurable ways. And so the question for us tonight, of course, well, that question being, is it by design? Is the purpose of the criminal legal system, at least as it relates to this group and other racial minorities, is the purpose of the system, is it to be a system of brutality, or are these outcomes that we often speak about, are they unforeseen consequences? So as we embark toward this new phase of political history, we know what lies before us with this election. We are still sort of sitting and wondering what will come this November. For some, their only question is, well, what will be of justice? Will justice come this time? Will my vote count? Will my body be seen? This will certainly be a question of mine if I were a Black woman or a Black trans person. Will my community receive resources? Will democracy spread? All of this and more, of course, is on the table come November. And tonight, of course, we have solicited the help of amazing experts who will aid us in unpacking all of this and some more. So in introducing our guests, first we have Andrea McChristian, Esquire, and she is the Law and Policy Director at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice. And in this capacity, she leads the implementation of the strategic vision and direction of the Law and Policy Program. Andrea oversees the programmatic function of the Institute's 3 pillars of social justice, democracy and justice, economic justice, and criminal justice reform, Prior to becoming the Law and Policy Director, she served as the Director of Criminal Justice Reform Initiative and has served as the primary author of 3 reports in the Bring Our Children Home Youth Justice series, which helped to form the basis of the 150 Years is Enough campaign. And what did this do? Well, it aimed to close New Jersey's youth prisons and reinvest those funds into community-based programs and services. Next, Dr. Sean Wilson, an assistant professor of sociology and criminal justice at William Patterson University. He is a community-based scholar whose research seeks to foreground voices of the voices and lived experiences, of the oppressed and marginalized. Dr. Wilson's research interests include reentry, critical policing, critical criminology, critical gang studies, and race and justice. He sits on the boards of several community organizations that are committed to social justice. Most notably, he has served on the North Community Advisory Committee at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, helping to serve the community by ushering change through community organizing and progressive changes in policy. He also serves on the New Jersey Supreme Court's Committee on Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement for the Passaic Vicinage. In this capacity, he works with professionals within the judiciary and other helping professions to educate primarily marginalized residents about offerings within the court system. Next, Dr. Andrea Boyles. She is the author of 2 University of California Press books. One book, You Can't Stop the Revolution, Community Disorder and Social Ties in Post-Ferguson America. This book being published in 2019. The next book, Race, Place, and Suburban Policing, Too Close for Comfort, published in 2015. She identifies as a critical feminist race scholar whose scholarship and public work account for social inequality and justice and injustice. And it is thematic to Black citizen police interactions, neighborhood disorder and disadvantage, community development and engagement, and resilience in collective action. She has previously taught within the Missouri prison system, served in various capacities in academia, as well as worked within corporations and organizations such as American Airlines and more. And she's done this on matters pertaining to race and discrimination. She has also served as a delegate to the United Nations Commissions on the Status of Women, and presently as a member and secretary of the Council for Sociologists for Women in Society. She holds her BA in English, an MA in sociology from Lincoln University of Missouri, and her PhD in sociology from Kansas State University with a concentration in gender and criminology. At the moment, she is serving as a visiting associate professor of sociology and Africana studies at Tulane University. Last but not least, Dr. Johanna Fernandez. She, an associate professor of history at Baruch College under the CUNY system, recently published her book as well. She is the author of The Young Lords, A Radical History. Dr. Fernandez's Freedom of Information Law lawsuit against the NYPD led to the recovery of the Lost Handshoe files, which was the largest repository of police surveillance records in the country, namely over 1 million surveillance files of New Yorkers compiled by the NYPD between 1954 and 1972, including those of Malcolm X. She is the editor of Writing on the Wall, Selected Prison Writings of Mumia Abu-Jamal, and writer and producer of the film Justice on Trial, The Case of Mumia Abu-Jamal. Her awards include the Fulbright Scholars Grant to the Middle East and North Africa, which took her to Jordan, and a National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship and in the Scholars in Residence program at the Schomburg Center. She directed and co-curated Presente, the Young Lords in New York, an exhibition. And this was shown in 3 New York City museums and actually cited by the New York Times as one of 2015's top 10 best in art. She received her BA in literature and American civilization from Brown and her PhD in US history from Columbia. And she also runs a wonderful radio show called A New Day on WBAI between 7 and 8 a.m. Monday through Thursday. And that's 99.5 FM. And that's in New York, by the way. So how are all of you? Thank you for joining.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
Happy to be here.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you.
So I want to sort of open up with a general question before I go into the respective areas. So each of you has engaged in some form of social justice activism in conjunction with your professional lives. I know that much about you for sure. So can you explain why this has been so important for you and what it means specifically during this moment? Let's start with you, Dr. Fernandez.
Okay, so why have I engaged in organizing work? How does one answer this question? I think that if you're a person of color and in the academy, there are so many assumptions of who we are and what we do that being in the world and being a fighter in the world, I think, comes with the territory. I think class has a lot to do with my my commitment to the world more so than the academy, right? So I was born in the Bronx during the crack epidemic, and I decided to become a professor because I thought that becoming a historian would somehow add to the conversation about the transformation of society. But unfortunately, the American university, more so than other universities around the world, appear to be disconnected from the grassroots and from public discourse. I'll say that I've been involved in political activism from the time I was in college. Again, because the school I went to literally looked at a person's ability to pay in the admissions process. That's Brown. Coming from the Bronx, that just didn't make sense. So of course I was involved in the struggle to transform that, to make education accessible to the people I left behind in the Bronx who I knew were capable. I continued my activism in graduate school, but then I got to Pittsburgh and I started visiting people on death row, and including Mumia Abu-Jamal, some who were guilty of the crime they were accused of, and others who proclaimed their innocence. It really didn't matter. It transformed my life, even though I had studied the criminal justice system before getting to death row, because it was clear that the system strips people of their humanity. And I think that experience of visiting people on death row really wedded me to the fight for human liberation and to the fight for humanizing the dehumanized by our system, racially dehumanized disproportionately.
Wow, wow. Dr. Boyles.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you again, Dr. Williams, for having me on and being a part of this awesome panel. I think one of the things that I've thought about, this whole idea of being engaged in activism, social justice activism, and then what that means in relations to my professional space, right? And so I don't know that those two are separate or could ever be separate for me. And I would extend that to Black folks in general, Black and brown people in the academy, period. But more specific to me, I don't see those two things as separate, because as far as I can remember, every space of progress in my life has meant resisting and pushing back against stereotypical ideas of who I could be. First off, who I was, who I could be, and what that meant for my life and those coming behind me. So I don't know that there has ever been a time where there's not been activism alive and well with me. I may not have been able to articulate it in the way that I can today, but the whole idea of resisting, refusing the status quo, refusing lack, because that is what characterized my beginning, right? My life from childhood up through college had been so incredibly characterized by indifference. And when I say indifference, meaning as a poor Black girl who had quite a bit of, interestingly, quite a bit of exposure to white influence. And so I understood early on that, you know, the grave injustice and how it didn't make sense for me to exist in the community that I did, with folks, you know, scraping and scratching to get by and not wanting that, you know, versus being on the other side of town or in another neighborhood, in another space where people ate different, people rode different, people holistically lived different. As a child, the visuals of it all didn't make sense. I have also, I think, for me, I had a mother who was very community engaged and who, even in her lack as a single parent, was sacrificial. And had a sacrificial spirit about how she saw to people in the neighborhood, people in the community, despite the fact that we didn't have in many instances. That is something that is very much a part of who I have, you know, how I was reared and who I've grown to be, even more so in that sense, in the sense of activism. The other thing is that I have spent, because and so when I share this, I'm sharing this really for the sake of transparency, not for the sake of provocativeness, because I know that there is there's something to be said when we start talking about being poor Black folks and coming from the block and the hood and all those kinds of things. There's a sense of provocativeness. There's like a fetish about it in academia. Yet it's so not what I'm on. What I'm saying is that I have spent a significant amount of time in my personal individual life, as well as that of others that surrounded me. I have spent time in the streets from childhood up to adulthood, where I cried with people who were in real serious pain, be it because they were standing at the crime tape, from losing a loved one, to interpersonal neighborhood violence, to that of police interaction. And so I think that I have not really had space to think about not engaging, is what I'm saying. Like, that has not been an option for me.
Yeah.
The idea to not be involved. I'm involved whether I'm on the outside of my door or inside of the house. It has been ongoing, it's been persistent. And so for me, the idea of social justice activism is evolving. It has been accumulative in the sense that I'm always actively thinking, whether I'm in an office, on a college campus, or whether I'm in the streets with the people, I'm actively thinking how to transform the landscape from one extreme to another. And that is what I have committed myself to. And if I had to use the words of some of the activists in my projects, what I have thought about, at least, as my revolutionary duty.
Deep. Counselor.
Well, first, thank you so much, Dr. Williams, for the invitation, and to Montclair State University for this great event. I think for me, since I was a child, my parents instilled in me, to whom much is given, much is expected. And so I knew very early on that giving back to my community service, whatever I could do, was kind of part of my lifeblood and my life charge. But it wasn't till I went to undergrad where, I was somewhat of a carefree college student, was like, let me just get these grades, not embarrass my parents. And some stuff happened on campus that was racist, and that was specifically problematic against Black women. And so I said, someone's gonna handle this. You student group, are you gonna take care of this? Crickets. You student activists, are you gonna handle this? Crickets. And so it was really an inflection point in my life where I went from someone who was just trying to make it and do well academically to someone who was like, if people aren't speaking for Black women on this campus, my friends and I needed to step up to the plate. And so it kind of radicalized me in that kind of instance where my whole life since that moment has become about Black people and Black women specifically. And so with undergrad, my friends and I brought the NAACP chapter back to campus that had been dormant for 10 years. And it kind of set off a path now. And I feel like within this national moment, we're having like a national inflection point where we're seeing what happened with George Floyd was just a powder keg that speaks to all the other structural inequities and cracks in the system of structural racism that you were speaking to in your introduction, Dr. Williams, around homelessness, around mental health issues, around education, around social services, that if we can properly resource Black and Brown communities at the front end, we aren't touching the mass incarceration system. We aren't touching the legal system, because the communities have what they need to feel protected and safe. And so I hope in this national inflection moment that we're taking seriously what Black and Brown communities need. We need police transformation, but more importantly, we need public safety transformation, because what's possible beyond traditional policing? We need to close our prisons. Point blank, period. We need reparations. And these are bold proposals that, many people raise their eyebrows, but we're at a bold moment that requires bold policy proposals, initiatives, and advocacy. And that's why I'm excited to be doing the work that I'm doing. I'm exhausted, but I'm also excited to be doing the work that I'm doing at the Institute in this moment in time.
Great. Dr. Wilson?
Yeah, I would just say that really my activism stems from my grandparents. Just spending time with my grandparents in Virginia and North Carolina during my summers as a child really just highlighted how harmful America has been to Black people. And as a young child, it really just filled me with rage and anger and frustration. And I needed to find a way to kind of channel that energy in a productive way. And by being involved in the community, by trying to change policies, by trying to change practices, was my way to channel that energy. Otherwise, I probably would have, I would be incarcerated right now, most likely. Like many of my family members and friends that have been impacted by the criminal injustice system. And I oftentimes think about Brian Stevenson, how he, speaks to us needing, especially scholars, us needing to be in proximity to the oppressed and marginalized. And that was something I always, took serious as a graduate student, undergraduate student, especially considering the institutions that I went to. So for example, New Jersey City University, where I earned my bachelor's and master's degree, is situated literally right in the hood of Jersey City. And I lived in the hood. So I felt that, these justice related issues directly impact me, because they did. I was subject to police brutality, racial profiling. One of my roommates was formerly incarcerated. He was on probation. So every day I would sit down and talk to him about his challenges. And I found it kind of, contradictory for me to be a criminal justice student and to listen to his struggles and not do something about it. And so that's always been my goal, my passion, my drive, is to try to change institutions of oppression. And also not just in the streets, but also in the academy, right? So challenging oppressive institutions that limit the creativity and abilities of Black scholars, right? We oftentimes do the groundbreaking community-based work that changes lives, but we find that institutions of higher ed aren't always supportive. And so it's important, to me at least, to be active in the community, but also active in holding institutions accountable. And so I like to do that with my, way of public engaging in public scholarship. And it drives me to improve community.
Wow. I mean, what a powerful opening. I just have to say, a powerful opening that leads us into the areas of discussion. And I hope too, for those listening, and especially students, right? People who are just looking to sort of go into their careers, if you will, you can see that you can bring activism with you, right? Into your careers, whatever that career might be. In the area of policing, Dr. Boyles, Regarding the Ferguson resistance in particular, you were there from the very start. In fact, I tell my students all the time about our little collective, when I'm teaching policing or ethnography, and the importance of having a reliable contact on the ground and so forth. But given your position, your position of being a part of that region, living there, so forth and so on, this gave you that bird's eye view of policing in Ferguson and in the broader St. Louis geographies, if you will. In your first book, Race, Place, and Suburban Policing, Too Close for Comfort, you talk about the distinction between suburban and urban policing. Why might this distinction be an important lesson for us following Ferguson?
So with the first book, Race, Place, and Suburban Policing, what I had hoped was that, one, I was working to extend what we knew about police and Black citizen interactions, particularly around place, right? Because much of the research had always centered, or at least paid significant amounts of attention to those exchanges in urban settings. And so here there had been some very high profile incidents where there had been decades upon decades of racial tension unfolding in a suburban community like 20 minutes roughly from Ferguson, where you ultimately resulted in a Black man walking in and open shooting and killing folks in a city council meeting. And then also within a couple of years, there had also been an incident where a young Black man retaliated against policing, law enforcement, and he shot and killed, pumped 7 bullets in the upper torso of a police sergeant. And so there had been also DOJ intervention that didn't begin with Ferguson, that actually started in a project, or at least it was one of the things that I was trying to capture and have a broader conversation about from the perspective of those poor Black people who were being scapegoated and didn't have a platform by which they could communicate all those various events that had taken place. It is also important to note that I was trying to also highlight the assumptions of place, right? This idea that Black people somehow only existed in the inner city, and poor Black people particularly. And that if there were Black folks living in suburban space, then they were probably middle or upper class, so to speak. And so what I found and thought was important to note is that there could be nothing quite different from those assumptions, right? There were pockets in enclaves of Black folks living in suburban space who were equally poor. And as some of them have characterized, it really became the ghetto extended across urban space, urban lines. And so here we had another situation of border patrol, right? Which is what ultimately started to play out. And I was able to flesh out more when it came to Ferguson. My initial hope and thought had been that I would be able to get that book, that first book, out the door to maybe provide evidence-based information to thwart incidents that could emerge subsequent to what had happened in that community. Unfortunately, it was just as that book was off to print, and the idea that maybe this would deter future incidents before it could get officially into print. It was during my final run through of edits that Mike Brown was killed. And so it is in that day, within hours, that it was, once he was killed, I was actually in the library across town combing through the last, and you all that have published, with that process, literally going through the last of the edits. And beelined ultimately from the library into Ferguson. And so hopefully, I think that answers your question. I don't want to go too far.
It definitely does, about race, place, right? Just the geographies of policing.
It was like the thing I was hoping to provide information, evidence-based information to avoid occurring again. It literally happened again in a way that exacerbated everything I had initially been discussing. And
we'll come back to that. Counselor, as you know, we've had our very own police and mishaps right here in Newark, New Jersey, that led to the police department having to enter under a consent decree. Being part of the monitoring team, you've paid witness to some of the consent decree processes with the Newark Police Department. Can you delve a bit into its purpose and why it was so important for the people of Newark to have that decree implemented?
Sure. So many people feel that the disconnect between Newark residents and Newark police actually stems back over 50 years to the Newark Rebellion. During the summer of 1967, it was sparked by police abuse of a Black cab driver in Newark, John Smith, which led to 5 days of civil unrest. Dozens were killed, millions of dollars in property damage that really spoke to not only, again, just like we're seeing this summer, the abuse of John Smith was just the powder keg that spoke to a number of systemic racist issues that were befalling Newark residents. And so for over 50 years, there was this fraught relationship that up until a few years ago, hadn't really been dived into until there was a launching of a Department of Justice investigation that found a number of unconstitutional policing practices were taking place in Newark, where there were unconstitutional stops, Black people were being disproportionately stopped. And in response to that Department of Justice investigation, the Department of Justice entered into the federal consent decree with the city of Newark that the city is currently under. That's a voluminous document that lays out that the Newark Police Division has to draft new policies, they have to train to those policies, and then we look at the auditing phase. And so consent decrees are really seen as the most transformative tool within traditional policing to reform traditional policing. And so we're in the 4th year of this process. So far, we've had over 16 policies developed that range from stop, search, and arrest, the First Amendment, to use of force, to body-worn cameras, to community policing, bias-free policing, and those have been imbued with community voice at the front end through review of trainings, through review of policies and feedback. And we're about to enter into, fully the auditing phase to understand if there's an actual culture change on the ground. But importantly, besides that consent decree process where the Institute is happy to serve on the monitoring team, again, this is traditional police reform. Something that's important to us as well is outside of traditional policing, what do communities need to feel safe? What does that look like? That looks like creating restorative justice models so that when there is a harm committed in the community, we can bring community actors together to see if the harm can be redressed outside law enforcement. That looks like non-police first responders. So if there's a mental health concern, where we know a lot of these police issues stem from mental health concerns, instead of having law enforcement come who may not be properly trained and may honestly escalate the situation, let's have a non-police first responder who's trained in mental health services come to resolve that as well. In addition, what we're looking into, as we know, the federal 1033 program allows local law enforcement to get basically free or very minimal cost military grade equipment, which, of course, would escalate police civilian relations with that, we're always should be aiming towards de-escalation, but bringing in armor, bringing in tanks would escalate those situations. And so what we hope to look at is what money is being used to maintain those military grade equipment, and how can we use those funds to better resource community-based alternatives to public safety. And so again, while we're happy to serve on the consent decree and see how far we can go within reforming traditional law enforcement, we think it's especially important to look at what community members need and what resources they need to keep themselves safe as well.
Yeah, and I love all of that. And as you were speaking, I'm like, oh, I wonder how that might even connect to some of the individuals in those suburban spaces, right? Poor Blacks in those suburban spaces that Dr. Boyles was talking about, who are often left out of those discussions, but who also would need those types of resources, those community-based resources. Dr. Wilson, your dissertation work, in your work, you canvass the inner cities of Baltimore, Maryland. And I understand in later publications and paper presentations, you spoke more comprehensively about some of your observations you experienced, such as the quote knockers that participants told you about. So aside from participants telling you about some of these occurrences, you actually stayed around long enough to experience it. Can you tell us about what these, quote, knockers are, and whether you think the Baltimore Department of Justice report that Andrea just told us about a little bit more in depth in the NORC context, but whether you think the DOJ report had any impact on your participants' plight? Are they better off today?
Great question. So I think Baltimore, it's important for us to pay close attention to Baltimore, especially after Freddie Gray's lynching, which happened in 2015, right? So we're in 2020 right now. So we're at a moment where we're talking about potentially reforming or even abolishing police. And Baltimore is a perfect example of kind of what police reform looks like. When you think about the consent decree and what it was supposed to change in Baltimore, as far as the unconstitutional policing, excessive force, the way they didn't respond to sexual assault cases, and just the inhumane practices which they unfortunately carried out on Black communities in Baltimore. And so I utilize Georgia Sabey's concept of petite apartheid, and it's tragically undercited and underappreciated. But Georgia Sabey argues that it's important for us to look at the daily informal interactions that individuals have, especially Black people, that we have with the police. Because oftentimes those are ignored, right? When we think about Baltimore, we typically think about Freddie Gray. When we think about New York, we think about Oscar Grant in Oakland, Eric Garner in New York, and others, right? We think about those individuals. Well, it's important, right, to think about, the harms that were caused to those individuals, but we oftentimes ignore the systematic issues, right, that happen daily. And when we think about Baltimore, we see that not much has really changed since the 2015 consent decree. And actually, shortly after the federal government began investigating the Baltimore Police Department, there were actually many police officers who were indicted for planting drugs on citizens, for harming citizens, stealing money from drug dealers, reselling their drugs, just engaging in corruption. And this is while they were under investigation. So those officers that I mentioned are the knockers. And knockers are essentially plainclothes police officers who terrorize Black communities, in particular in Baltimore. And so they also call them the jump out boys. And so they'll randomly jump out on people, harass people, beat people up. There were instances where the knockers would pick up a gang involved individual and take him to another hood where he has beef and drop him off. And that person would have to fend for themselves. And so these were daily interactions. Many of my narrators had daily interactions with the knockers. And unfortunately, I had my own experience with the knockers while I was collecting my data. Sitting in the front of the row house, asking questions, unmarked police car, pulls up on us. And he immediately just hops out and starts yelling, where's the drugs? Where's the drugs? Where's the drugs? So he puts us, up against the wall, searches us, and me, I had all my my instrument, had field notes and everything, and the officer, he realized that I wasn't from Baltimore, so he asked me, like, what are you doing here? I explained to him, I'm conducting research, and the officer told me, you're one of them smart ones, aren't you? Meaning, one of them smart Blacks, and pretty much, threw my field notes in the street. He didn't find any drugs, hopped back in his car, and that was it. And my narrators tell me that this is something they experience daily. Wow. And it hasn't stopped. And in a sense, many community members feel that the consent decree wasn't effective. I mean, there have been many instances and reports of police officers, although they had to implement a body-worn camera program, there have been many instances where police officers have actually played around with the body-worn cameras. Instances where they've tried to get individuals to admit to engaging in crime, even though they didn't. So there are ways around many of these reforms that haven't necessarily improved citizens' experiences and perceptions of police. And so I think it's important for us to pay close attention to Baltimore and even North, what's going on in North, to better transform policing in society.
Wow. Whew. I mean, it just goes to show, and it also connects back to what, Andrea McChristian, like what you were saying, as far as going beyond traditional policing, right? If these reforms are showing not to work, then what is going to work? Dr. Fernandez, as noted in your bio, you have long had these battles with the NYPD around a variety of social justice causes, and I can name many of them. But when you encapsulate the many issues you've been fighting around for many, many years, and the issues you've written about, under the banner of surveillance, when you encapsulate it under the banner of surveillance, how would you go about addressing the importance of we the people, right? We the people needing to be ever vigilant about the institution of policing as a surveillance collector, and particularly in relation to marginalized people?
Okay, so where does one start with the police? I think that, and with this whole apparatus of surveillance, because ultimately it's an epic apparatus of surveillance at the level of the community, but also in the prison. It's an extension of the same process of containing and surveilling slaves. Essentially, this is how it starts, right? So the first police departments emerge to essentially return escaped slaves back to the plantation, as we all know, but to contain rebellion. I don't know what to say about the police versus we the people, other than that I just learned that during the pandemic, billionaires in the United States increased their wealth by 30%. This is on top of a society that was already savagely unequal. So when you have that kind of savage inequality, you have to contain the people most likely to resist. And historically, the police has served that function in the United States, in Nigeria, in Haiti, in the Dominican Republic, in Puerto Rico, and around the world. So the police has one function: to keep the natives in their place. And so when we talk about we the people, what we know is that the police is anathema to our daily aspirations and our survival, because literally it's an institution created to circumscribe, contain, keep us in our place, which is why I think that we've been having this conversation for how long? This didn't start today. Police brutality, you look at history, it's the same narrative over and over and over and over again. And the reforms that are being implemented today are not really that different from those that were implemented in the early, or were proposed in the early part of the century. There is a conversation about the abolition of the police today, and it's incredible that we're having that conversation. But objectively speaking, the abolition of the police would have to come along with a revolutionary transformation of society such that we won't have such savage inequalities. I'll end here on the issue of the police. Mm-hmm. Across time and space, the military has been known and is expected to turn to the people and support people's movements in revolutionary situations. So in revolutionary situations across time and space, the military goes to the side of the people. The police has never, will never, has never in history sided with the people in the context of an uprising. And that's because it's a special force drawn from the working class that ultimately has to be separated from the working class so that it can perform its function. And it is treated like a brotherhood. It's given special perks. It's the only profession that a working class person could have without significant education and make hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? In overtime. And then retire with the wages that you had at the end of your career when you worked overtime around the clock. I mean, that doesn't exist for anybody else. And so in order for the police to do its function, it has to be given special perks. It has to be separated from the working class. It has to be treated like it's above the law. What can you do to reform that body? Its very essence, its culture is in opposition to the aspirations of the people. And we know that police stop a crime in process like once in 200 years. Literally, that's a statistic. So what's the purpose of the police? The purpose of the police, we're seeing it in the streets. They're there to bust heads when the natives rise up.
Yeah, I mean, we do know that our criminal justice system was designed to be reactive, right? So it's not responding to crime before it occurs. Deep accounts on the area of policing. Moving into the courts, though, starting with you, counselor, there is much disarray following the Breonna Taylor grand jury proceedings. And I received many questions from my students, from community members, asking about even just the purpose of the grand jury. Why does it exist? Unfortunately, we know there is a history of grand juries refusing to indict officers against any and all citizens, but especially when the victims are Blacks, right? So they just refuse to indict these officers. 2 questions. Can they assume another indictment against the officer under current law? And should these grand jury proceedings be used in situations like these?
Sure. So, I mean, to the first question, I can't say. I would hope that, if the legal system was actually just, yes, if it actually operated in a way that was supposed to support and help and advance Black interests, yes. But we know that. Why was the law created? The law was not created to benefit marginalized people. The law was created to uphold, at the time, landed white heteronormative men, and has been promulgated in such a way since our nation's founding. So, I mean, I would like to be hopeful, but I think the fact that we were even to get as much information as we were able to get was not because of the legal system, but was because of a juror who had faith and who had conviction, who wanted to hold truth to power, because they said, maybe I don't understand all the legal implications, but I know this isn't right. I know something's wrong here, and I'm going to champion what, with my conscience. And so it wasn't even the law doing what the law was supposed to do. It was an individual. And so I think on the second point, grand jury proceedings are such an interesting and fascinating process that honestly even confound a lot of lawyers about how the system is supposed to operate. But I think that something, and part of why I know I personally want to become a lawyer is, even though I don't do direct services, is to somewhat demystify the idea of the law as much as I can for Black and Brown communities, because it's always seen as this horribly complicated web that we have to navigate. And it's done that way by design, because that's why you see pro se clients have such a struggle representing themselves, because you turn in a document one day late, your case is thrown out. You didn't do this one motion this proper way, your motion is dismissed. And I know for me personally, even when I was in law school, one of my clients was representing himself pro se. He had been incarcerated for about 20 years on a wrongful conviction. He had represented himself for like 20 years and had filed habeas cases, which, if anyone knows, habeas law is one of the most complicated legal bodies when someone's been incarcerated and trying to free themselves. And so I think the grand jury proceedings and the confusion around it really just speaks overall to the confusion of the law. The fact that the law was not necessarily designed to help, but was designed to maintain a certain status quo. And so to your initial question, Dr. Williams, I'm hopeful that we're able to get another indictment. The law is going to do what it's going to do in many situations. Sorry to end on a downbeat, but
completely understand and agree also. Dr. Wilson, quoting from CNN, a report that was made public Thursday reveals, quote, long simmering racial tensions, unquote, among court officers and racist statements made openly by attorneys, judges, and other courthouse personnel, in New York State courts. The report was spurred by the killing of George Floyd and came 2 days after a Brooklyn court officer allegedly posted a racist illustration depicting President Obama with a noose around his neck. While we are quick to unpack racial tensions within policing, what may be the implications of delving through examples such as the one just described?
Great question. Yeah, I mean, so we're so, many of us are focused on policing, but we also need to look at the courts. And, that highlights the reason why. But also, if we look at Nicole Gonzalez Van Clee's work, Crook County, how that highlights how many of these courts are anti-Black institutions. And so I kind of argue that justice for a racist white person is Black oppression. And so we kind of see the reproduction of oppression within these court systems. And I oftentimes think about Peter Kraska's work on criminal justice theory. And when you think about criminology as a discipline, we're oftentimes focused on researching crime and responses to crime, that we don't really focus on how the criminal justice system operates to oppress, marginalize, and control Black communities, and how Black oppression is a crime, right? How these courts that harm Black communities, that's a crime. And criminologists, there are some, right, critical criminologists, but for the most part, criminology as a discipline has failed to really critically analyze these oppressive institutions, such as the court. And I kind of think about the importance of, this election right now. When we think about all the judges that Trump has had the ability to appoint and how the majority of them are white. There's no representation when it comes to Black folk, right? So I guess it's almost, according to his administration, we don't matter. Our views, our lived experiences, our perceptions, our perspectives don't matter. And when we think about justice and experiencing the court, I kind of think about the work that I've been doing here in Passaic County, sitting on the DICE committee, which works to make the courts more accessible for Black and brown communities. Yeah. And especially during this pandemic, it's extreme when a lot of court services are moving digital and online. And we know about the great digital divide, right? How Black communities overwhelmingly don't have access to the internet, and how that can complicate their experiences navigating the court, especially family court. And the judge, one of the judges that I work with here in Passaic County, Judge Yolanda Adrianzan, who's a Latinx woman, she has worked hard on making the courts more accessible, listening to citizens' needs, meeting their needs, right? Informing the public about how the court operates, their rights, how to navigate in the court system. Because many Black and brown people are fearful of the court. We don't want to step inside a court. I don't, personally myself, I've been, I've been stopped so many times by police and given tickets and having to go to court and have to have my life complicated that I don't even want to step foot in the court. And that's a lived experience and reality for many Black people. And so it's important for us to re-examine the court system. And that's an important conversation as well, especially in these times.
Oh yeah, yes. Especially when you think about the necessity in this moment of the family court, you know, with domestic violence rates going through the roof, divorce rates, different things of that sort. You know, access to the court is definitely needed. Dr. Fernandez, but what about equal access to the courts? You know, you have long been an advocate for Mumia Abu-Jamal, and while his troubles with the courts are well documented, you know, I must say personally, aside from the criminal proceedings, his quest to get medical attention with hopes of reprieve through the courts was most depressing for me. Is there a different kind of court system for people like he?
Mumia Abu-Jamal is accused of killing a white police officer in Philadelphia. And as Rochelle, a Black police officer in Philadelphia, who's been in the news lately, told me, there's no middle ground to killing a police officer. Because in the post, she didn't tell me this, but in the post-civil rights movement era, the killing of a police officer and Black men as police killers came to replace the myth of Black men as rapists. And that's because of the rebellion launched by the Black Panther Party, which was not an operation to kill police, but rather to defend the Black community from police violence through the use of Second Amendment rights legally in the courts. That's what happened in Oakland in 1966. So when Black people assert their Second Amendment rights to protect their community, they are, Black men in particular, criminalized and depicted in the public imagination as cop killers. And of course, part of what we see happening in this post-Black Power era is that the life of police officers are elevated above the lives of the rest of us. Mumia is a political prisoner, and there's no justice in the courts around political prisoners, and someone like him in particular, because the Fraternal Order of Police, the largest police organization in the world, has made it its moral assignment to keep Mumia behind bars. And I'll just give you one example. Mumia finally won relief on a grievance. And the grievance was that the judge who reviewed his appellate process had a conflict of interest and should have recused himself because he had previously been a prosecutor. Imagine that. That's another issue with the criminal justice system, that it's very incestuous. Prosecutors become judges. And they, in fact, oversee the same cases as prosecutors and judges. Well, in 2016, the Williams case established for the first time the parameters of judicial bias, that you can't be both prosecutor and judge in the same case. Mumia won. And that meant that all of his appeals from the 1990s to 2012, which had been denied by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court, were now up for re-review. Well, what did the Fraternal Order of Police do through the widow of the fallen police officer that Mumia is wrongfully accused of killing? She filed what is known as a King's Bench petition. Rare, unheard of, no one imagined that this would fly in the courtroom. It's a special and rare petition that asked the Pennsylvania Supreme Court to override all of the decisions of the lower courts and intervene in a special case concerning the well-being of the citizens of Pennsylvania. So she argued that the Pennsylvania Supreme Court had to intervene and stop the course of justice in Mumia's case. Why? Because she argued the prosecutor in Mumia's case, Larry Krasner, who's a progressive prosecutor, had a conflict of interest and was in cahoots with Mumia's attorneys. So that's what. So the case has been stopped for the last 6 or 7 or 8 months because of the influence of special interests in the process, the Fraternal Order of Police. And it's not any special interest. What we see, the problem with the courts is that the prosecutors and the police are and the judges are in bed with each other. So what justice system are we talking about? And this is Mumia. This is not just about Mumia. Of course, Mumia is a special case because he's a political prisoner, but this is what happens in the justice system day in and day out.
Yeah, the takeaway on that, the incestuous nature of the court system in terms of like how prosecutors graduate into judges, I think is something to definitely underscore here. Alongside everything else, of course, but that is something that, I don't think most people think about. Dr. Boyles, the non-verdict of Officer Wilson sent fire waves through the nation, of course. And once again, you were there for it all. Given your many hours of participant observation and your attendance at hundreds of community events, what say you about the community members' trust within the court system, particularly, well, I would say in Ferguson, but in the surrounding area then and now?
So to be clear, St. Louis is home, born and raised in St. Louis. And so when the nation and the world is discussing these issues, that's home to me. So that's not just space where, it just happens to be, a headline, right? Mm-hmm. That is actually home. These are neighborhoods that I'm intimately familiar with, and a system that as a resident, I have been subject to at the state and local level. The same ones that are playing out against Michael Brown, even in death, the same system that is playing out and exonerated essentially Darren Wilson, kept him out of court. And so I take all these matters, I take a special, I am especially tuned in because it's hometown. But having said that, folks have been distrustful of the system holistically in St. Louis, just like Black folks across the nation, just like Black folks across the world historically, because the story has been the same across locations. It's not changed. And the reality of it is that St. Louis and Missouri particularly has extended. We've got to think about it, I guess, historically, is a state that actually requested extending enslavement. So we can have a conversation about Ferguson, and we can have a conversation about Ferguson being a suburb of St. Louis, but we also need to have a conversation about St. Louis being embedded in a state that requested the expansion of enslavement. Mm-hmm. So there is a deep, and also within the context of it being the same very state, the same very city in which the Dred Scott case was tried as well. So there is a long-standing, deep-rooted history in the state of Missouri as a red, very conservative state that had extremely supported enslavement. But there is also one when we talk about St. Louis and the political dynamic and the maneuvering across urban and suburban space in terms of Derek Wilson, that he is one of several. I'm going to say that particularly because what did not get covered as much is that Darren Wilson, the decision to not indict him or charge him and then to have that repeated is also along lines of other ambiguous police shootings that happened immediately following Brown's murder. and alongside of other instances where cases have been exonerated, police officers have been exonerated on the heels of Darren Wilson's the first decision to not indict him. So media is not covering that, but that's where I come in at, because I'm consistently watching from case to case intimately and standing in the streets with these families one after the other, in a community one after the other, not just reeling from the situation attached to Mike Brown and the failure or what have you to bring that case to justice, but the consistency in which there have been countless cases that are playing out well before him, leading into him, and subsequently where there have not been charges happening as well. People have also had a conversation about the fact that we have in St. Louis County now a Black prosecuting attorney. And so I want to also address that too. So here's the thing, I don't know what he looked at, what he didn't look at, or what have you. I'm not even going to, to speak to it because I don't know. But I do know that the idea that wherever we are, good, bad, or indifferent, the idea that somehow Blackness automatically equates to justice is mythical. Because what I want to be clear, and I'm going to say this, there were Black slaveholders. Yeah, there were some, there were some Black folks that did actually own slaves. I'm not implying that that is the case with the prosecutor in St. Louis County. But what I am saying is this idea that racism or injustice can only occur at the hands of white people is mythical. I think that it's important for us to understand that injustice happens regardless of who's at the helm. The system is what it is. It is learned behavior. It is practiced behavior, and it is just not for white people. It is culturally induced, culturally accepted, and culturally expected. And so just like white folks are a part of that cultural indoctrination and socialization, likewise is the case for Black and brown people. So whether we talk about what happened in terms of prosecuting or the lack thereof from St. Louis County to that in the case of Breonna Taylor in Kentucky, the truth of the matter is the system is what it is, and that there are actors within it that walk and act in concert with a system, a broad system beyond policing, beyond courts. We're talking about the structuring, the blueprint for America. The blueprint in and of itself, irrespective of policing, courts, corrections, or whatever the case might be, has not been favorable or given the benefit of the doubt to Black people, has not valued Black life in and of itself. And so actors within it work in concert with it, irrespective of their racial identity. And I think that's important to note.
Oh, moving into corrections and for attendees, we're just about to come to you, but and we'll try to encapsulate some of your questions that might be relative to corrections. But I do want to get to one of the correction questions that will go back to you, counselor, because it does speak to youth. I think oftentimes when we have these conversations, we don't speak enough about the kids. So at the New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, you helped to jumpstart the 150 Years is Enough campaign. And I just love that slogan. I love it. Talk a bit about why it was important to finally foreground youth justice in that endeavor.
Sure. So Dr. Williams, I think to frame that, I want to tell a story about the Bordentown School. So the Bordentown School was founded in 1886 by the formerly enslaved Reverend Walter Rice. It was a school that sat on 400 acres in Bordentown, New Jersey, that was a state-run elite boarding school for New Jersey's Black youth. It was called the Tuskegee of the North after Booker T. Washington's Tuskegee Institute was visited by Albert Einstein, W.E.B. Du Bois, Mary McLeod Bethune, just to name a few. And after in the 1950s, when there was an attempt to integrate the school and it only attracted 2 white students, the Bordentown School was closed in 1955. And so what now sits on the land that was once home to the Tuskegee of the North is Hayes, New Jersey's girls' youth prison. And across the street is JMSF, the state's most secure youth prison for boys. And so I think that as we speak in this Black Lives Matter moment where so many people in New Jersey are jumping onto that hashtag, we see that the investments that the state of New Jersey is actually willing to make against Black young people. And so our campaign, 150 Years is Enough, was named for the year that Jamesburg, the state's oldest youth prison and largest youth prison for boys, was first opened, and it's still open and used today. And we really see youth prison abolition as a racial justice issue for a number of reasons. First, New Jersey has the worst Black to white youth incarceration disparity rate in the entire country. So a Black youth in New Jersey is 21 times more likely to be locked up than a white youth. We also have the 4th highest Latino to white youth incarceration disparity rate. In addition, we're spending $300,000 to incarcerate each child in the state youth prison. Imagine the good that we could do in a child's life at the front end by giving them such an investment to make sure they never touch the system in the first place. In addition, we're spending millions of dollars to incarcerate these kids in largely empty, faraway youth prisons. The budget shows that we have about 186 kids on average locked up in our state. So we have relatively low numbers because violent youth crime is on the decline. And so we're seeing declining numbers nationwide within our youth prisons. But we're seeing 186 kids locked up in 3 youth prisons that are built for 511 young people. In addition, the governor this week signed legislation that will release thousands of people from adult prisons in New Jersey and juvenile justice commission facilities in response to the public health crisis. In total, about at least 90 kids will be released from the JJC facilities. So I told you we only had 186 kids locked up. 90 of those kids will be released. So even smaller numbers, and that can't be justified when we know that community-based placements and community-based treatment and services is more effective at rehabilitating young people, especially from a system where our current youth prisons, we see about 28% of young people released from these youth prisons end up right back within them within 3 years. So they're not increasing public safety. So with our campaign, we want to reinvest funds, $100 million actually into front-end youth programs. And we take that $100 million from the amount that Governor Murphy previously committed to tackling the opioid crisis, which we know affects certain demographics. And we want to make sure that those goes into our Black and brown communities to make sure our kids stay with their families, stay within their communities. And if in the small instance, they have to be placed out of home because they safely can't be rehabilitated in the community, they should be in community-based placement so that they can be connected to their communities and don't have to worry about reintegration upon release.
Which again, research shows is the best route forward, right, for these youth. And it's a form of racial justice.
Exactly.
Which we need on this matter. So what I want to do is pivot to some of the Q&As since we are at that 7:50 to 8 o'clock time point. And my great friend, Dr. Emily Isaacs, is going to come in now and help to coordinate that with us. Thanks for being back. You'll have to unmute. There you go.
You'd think after all these months I know how to unmute, but apparently I don't. So I have a first question from Dylan Barton. I'm curious to know of the history of the phrase mass incarceration. I think I'm drawn strongest to the word mass. Why the use of this word and not, say, disproportionate, as in disproportionate incarceration?
Any shot by the panelists?
So this is, I think this is the term that is now popular, but other criminologists and students in the carceral state also say hyper. It's a hyper incarceration of certain groups of people in the United States, Black people, other people of color, Latinos in particular. And I just want to say one thing. So yeah, it is. It doesn't quite reflect what's actually going on. Dr. Williams, when you were talking earlier, your introduction, you mentioned the Black codes, but as you continued the conversation, it was very clear that we have Black codes today. We're just not calling it that.
Mm-hmm.
And we need to get back to calling it Black codes to really reflect reality. This is what I have to say about hyper incarceration and mass incarceration. And we know these statistics. In 1973, there were 200,000 people imprisoned in America. Today, we have 2.3 million people imprisoned in America. The rate of crime has remained the same. This disfiguration of our communities is a crime against humanity. It's a crime against humanity. Our communities have been destroyed. Parents have been separated from children. In the Bronx, not too long ago, an alphabet soup of militarized police organizations descended in Eastchester, the Eastchester neighborhood, and arrested 120 youth, the Eastchester 120, in a gang raid that used the RICO laws, which essentially is the law that uses association to put folks in prison. It was initially supposedly deployed against the mafia, but it's been mostly used against young Black people in the United States. So this is a crime against humanity. And when I think about the reforms that are being proposed to end the police and its militarization or end the mass incarceration, I'm thinking there is an ocean of injustice that should never have happened. And our proposal is to literally take a little spoon and empty the ocean with a spoon. That's what reform, look, it's insane. Oh, how are we going to solve it? Oh, through progressive prosecutors. How is that possible? The job of a prosecutor is to prosecute. We need to decarcerate. We need to decarcerate and figure out other more humane means of addressing social problems. We need schools. We need hospitals. We need community centers. We need a different kind of justice, restorative justice. Every time I've been speaking a lot, we've all been speaking a lot, and especially in these 501c3 meetings that are happening everywhere, there's always a conversation about violence, the violence in our communities. People are being evicted across the country right now. That's violence. That's the real violence that exists in our communities that in fact lead to greater problems. So I think that I'll end with this. In 1864 or 1860, at the start of the Civil War, the abolitionists were looked at like they were crazy, and in fact, they were shot up at. They were the abolitionists, people who were talking about the end of slavery, were feared for their lives because they were being attacked. They were thought of as crazy people. And within 5 years, a form of slavery had ended. We have an opportunity really to be the crazy people who say, yeah, we got to get rid of the prisons, hook, line, and sinker. They don't have a place in our society if we say that we're human and humanistic.
Our next question is about performative activism. The question is from Charcy Wiggum is, what are the panelists' thoughts on performative activism from politicians and non-Black people as a form of minimizing Black trauma?
I'll hop in on that. It is extremely insulting. And let me say this and be clear, in terms of activism, even as a Black woman born and raised in St. Louis, ground zero for 21st century Black resistance, the emergence of Ferguson, that didn't grant me access to the movement. I have had to say that time and time again, and I have been purposeful in saying it because there is an assumption that if you show up, automatically you are granted access into the movement. That's not what that is. So you can participate and mean well and be well-intended on many levels. But I want to be clear that with the many, many layers of insider status that I bear, I still had to check my pearls at the door. I never stepped foot on ground zero, assuming that because I'm a homegirl, that automatically gave me access. I was an administrator on the ground. And so my authority on a college campus didn't grant me authority in resistance space. I understood that. That's earned. There is a measure of sacrifice that takes place mentally, emotionally, and otherwise. These are folks, based on my experience, that are not engaging just for the sake of the camera lens. These are people who live and breathe sacrificially from sun up to sundown. They did that before Brown's death and many of the other ambiguous killings and so forth were really not ambiguous. My point is these issues as they emerge, whether live or dead, these are people who are living in many respects sacrificially for the sake of community all day, every day, with their lives hanging in a balance. And so the idea that folks just walk up and automatically I'm in, no. There is an earning, there is a recognition of privilege that ought to take place in order to even have some semblance of advocacy. And I think that is misused and abused in ways that is just is the same as law enforcement. It is equally damaging, it's hurtful, it sets back the mission, the movement. It is undermining to the revolution. It is exploitive of the people on the ground who receive death threats all day, every day. And the news media, from one extreme, one network to the next, don't really talk about. I think that we are gravely misunderstanding the depth in which sacrifice means and looks like for these people as they exist from sun up to sundown. And so the performance of it all, that gets called out on the ground, at least in the spaces where I have been. You can't, those kinds of things they lead to further mistrust. People are very conscientious about who they join or align themselves with. They don't go to every table because every table is not about progress. Every table is not about revolutionizing and transforming the mission. So I think we really need to, and I'm not suggesting not to be involved, but what I am suggesting is the same way as a Black woman with all sorts of inside status, same way I have to check my privilege and stand down. I really encourage folks who are going to be involved in these processes that you too recognize your spaces of privilege, check that, stand down. You're not in charge. You're not. And so it is undermining to suggest or conduct oneself as if that's the opposite.
And can I just add on to that? Because I think in this, and kind of centering it in New Jersey within this national moment that we're happening here in New Jersey, we have also been met with very insulting performative activism where, for example, last year we had in the 1619 moment, the 400-year anniversary, introduced reparations task force legislation. And so as we're seeing right now that there needs to be meaningful investment in Black communities, we called on the legislature and the governor who are saying Black Lives Matter kind of every week. What's going on with the reparations task force? Oh, wait, hold on for that. we're going to eliminate the title name freeholder. That'll do it. Okay, maybe we didn't go far enough. Well, how about we get some low-hanging fruit? How about following what happened to George Floyd, let's at least just get a chokehold ban. Oh, well, we don't know about that. Let's make Juneteenth a state holiday instead. So what we're being met with is when we're trying to do both bold policy proposals and things that honestly are low-hanging reforms, we're being met with performance. We're being met with things that look great for optics, but aren't making meaningful investments in Black communities. And so just to do a plug, something that we've done at the Institute, we created this document, 10 ways to do racial justice advocacy after you say Black Lives Matter. And I can put it in the chat. That includes policies ranging from youth justice transformation to community-based public safety options, to creating that reparations task force, to just doing a chokehold ban. That we think that these are 10 things ranging from reform to the boldest proposals we can possibly think of that can make New Jersey actually move away from just rhetoric about Black Lives Matter to actually making sure Black Lives Matter in the state.
Can I chime in real quick, if you don't mind? Yeah, I think it's important for us to hold fake allies accountable in any way that we can, because they're extremely dangerous. And so I think about so we briefly discussed mass incarceration, and I do a lot of work around reentry. And I've noticed that a lot of, in particular, white women, I hope I'm not offending anybody, but a lot of white women have begun going into prisons as a way to, I guess, educate the incarcerated. And my amazing sisters at the Jam My Sisterhood, which includes Dr. Brielle Willingham, Dr. Aaron Corbett, Dr. Bahia Muhammad, and others have spoke to this reality. They have addressed how harmful this can be, right? Going into prisons and with trying to colonize these spaces. And meanwhile, we have sisters who are doing the work, who are directly impacted by mass incarceration, who have the lived experience. And so I think it's important in these times to foreground the marginalized, foreground Black and brown people's voices, lived experiences, and take a step back. Because it's really not about you right now. And I've seen a lot of people who are trying to get, I guess, social justice warrior stickers that they can put on their walls and say, I'm an ally and I'm an advocate. And I mean, it's important. We need allies, but there's a way to do it. You can be behind the scenes fighting for justice. I mean, we have many amazing allies here in the state of New Jersey, with many of the institutions and organizations that I work with, and they do the work and you wouldn't even know about it. And so I think that's problematic, especially in the age of social media, where a lot of people want likes and retweets, and it's cool to say Black Lives Matter. But do you practice that daily? Are you practicing that in your lives? And so I think that's important.
We have a couple questions on police reform and abolition of the police, and I'll take this one. I'm from Kalfani Toure. As a former police officer and Black man, I know police misconduct personally. How can we productively abolish police along with the deep structural violence that prevails in this society?
Can you repeat that question?
Yes. Kafani Torres, as a former police officer and Black man, I know police misconduct personally. How can we productively abolish police along with the deep structural violence that prevails in this society? So it's about abolishing the police.
Well, I would say that we first need to listen to the people who come in contact with police the most. And I think that's the best way to go about finding solutions to what works. Because oftentimes we have all these technocrats who don't really have the lived experience, don't know what it's like to live in a community that's under constant police surveillance. And as a result, we have all these flawed reforms that don't really change the systematic issues within policing. And so it has to be community-based. It has to be based on what the community wants and needs. And I think that's been one of the major issues within policing in many of their policies, is that they don't really listen to the community. And these aren't new issues, right? These have been issues that have been happening for decades. And we continue to have these same problems. Like for Baltimore, for instance, these are historical issues. And there have been so-called reforms that really haven't changed much. And so I think the problem lies with our inability not to take the concerns and lived experiences of the oppressed and marginalized serious. The way we criminalize these communities, we tolerate police brutality, many of us in society, and that's extremely problematic. So I think we need to rethink how we view the police, but how we view these communities that are oftentimes over policed. If we see their humanity, perhaps society will begin to think about changing some of these oppressive institutions. And so we kind of see that now with how Black Lives Matter is beginning to be embraced by more white people. They're beginning to have these conversations in their circles. They're beginning to even re-examine their thoughts and perceptions of police, although they don't have the similar lived experiences. And so like Dr. Williams always, speaks to in his research of how policing is intersectional, it truly is intersectional. And we must take that into consideration when crafting policies. And like Dr. Boyles mentioned, just because a city has a Black police chief doesn't mean that those practices and policies are going to change. And even in instances where there are individuals within these institutions who want to change these institutions, we find that they meet backlash. If you look at the NYPD 12, the amazing documentary Crime and Punishment highlights the struggles that the courageous NYPD 12 experienced, some of the retaliation they experienced for pointing out systematic racism within the NYPD. And so it's kind of complicated, to discuss these issues with my students, because many of them want to go into the system to change it. And it's kind of hard to do so when this has been a historic institution that has historically marginalized, killed, and oppressed, Black communities. So I just think that we need to look at these issues in a nuanced, intersectional, critical way.
Can I say something really quickly, give an example? And this is something that Jose Saldaña has said a number of times. He's the director of Release Aging People in Prison. There are thousands of elderly people in prison, people over the age of 50, who stand to die in prison if they get COVID-19, who've done 20, 30 years, who are not going to be engaged in recidivism, but these are people with an enormous amount of experience as diplomats in the prison. This is a proposal. I mean, Jose Saldaña is one of those people who spent 30 years in prison, and now he's directing Release Aging People in Prison, one of the most incredible people I've interviewed and talked to. Why not bring those people who've spent a lifetime in prison and train them and introduce them to the community to help us resolve conflict? These are people who've been doing this in the prison because of their position, because they've been in prison for so long, and because they've transformed themselves through not because of the prison system, but through their own personal study and transformation.
I want to say something, if I could. For one thing, I want to be clear. I mentioned and talked about how having a Black person at the helm doesn't automatically equate to justice, right? But I also want to be clear that it does matter to have symbolic representation. We want symbolic representation across places that will work transformatively. So I don't think one has to be sacrificed for the other. I think that we need to be more transformative in how we think about it and not create these mythical ideas about what that looks like. I also want to be clear in that when we talk about violence, right? And how do you abolish policing and then simultaneously or get rid of, violence, against Black people in general. Well, so here's the thing. I think that we are often thinking about policing somehow as this separate entity, like that tends to get the highlight, the focus, and in many cases, rightfully so, to some measure, because that is what's being captured in real time in video. That's the thing that we're seeing time and time again play out in our everyday, and people are likelier to come into contact with policing than any other aspect of the government. Police are the enforcers of government, right? So I think it matters. But what I want to make clear, or at least say, is that part of the problem is that we don't begin at the beginning. See, we need to start at the root. We're tap dancing and trying to transform, I guess, let's say a tree, as if the tree didn't have roots, right? We're trying to deal with, the idea that, and policing is an effect of a broader kind of violence. See, let's define what violence is and what that means, so we don't separate it for police violence versus, so the violence, the initial violence that is not being targeted is racism. Racism is violent. We can't, if we eliminate policing today, we still got to deal with racism as violence in the school system, racism as violence in the job place, racism as violence everywhere. I guess my point is that it is white supremacy and racism that in and of itself that has proven violent to Black people historically. Policing is a component of that violence, enforced and reinforced and exacerbated in more ways than one. And so I think that the idea of being critical and moving forward with, and even thinking about abolition, didn't have to be one separate from or somehow set apart in terms of here's policing over here, but then here's violence. So no, it's all violence, and it all is violence stemming from racism as violence.
I'm going to move us, thank you. I'm going to move us to a broader question from Donna Davis, Dr. Donna Davis, here from Montclair State, who thanks you for sharing your expertise and says she's enjoyed the conversation. She's a teacher educator at Montclair State University, preparing primarily white females to work chiefly in New Jersey elementary schools. What do future teachers need to know about your topic, youth incarceration, especially regarding Black and Brown students and those overclassified with learning disabilities?
Sure, I can start us off. So I think research has shown that Black children as young as preschool age are seen as more adult, as more mature than their white counterparts. Starting from those early ages, teachers, unfortunately, in many cases, it breaks down along racial lines, criminalize the same behavior in Black students that their white counterparts engage in as well. This leads to an overclassification of Black young people as those with disabilities, which leads to their school push out and inclusion within the youth justice system. So I think the first thing is to check yourself, honestly, before you step into spaces where you'll be teaching mainly students of color, to understand that you most likely have those implicit biases already and do what is necessary to educate yourself and counter against them. Also, figuring out if maybe there is another reason that a young person may be acting out. ACEs is a very important factor. Trauma that they may have experienced at home that they're bringing to the school environment is a very important factor. Learn about your students, talk to your students, because a classification, especially one at an early age, can be the first marker that puts their foot into the youth justice system. So I think just being as educated and aware of your own biases as you can is the most important thing I can think of.
Thank you. There's a question about Charcy Wiggum, who says, oftentimes people that are disabled and people of color are left out of the narrative of criminal justice reform, even though this group is disproportionately affected by police brutality. What are your thoughts on that?
They're not trained that's part of the argument. And first off, so inherently, they have been really and truly situated as if babysitters for communities that, or that have been historically scapegoated by the federal government. So folks who have been identified, I guess my point is that it's a social Darwinistic perspective. It's a social Darwinistic approach. Only the strong will survive. Well, the idea that only the strong will survive, and therefore anybody less than should be left to their own demise, should just sort of fall off. They are considered or identified as social baggage, so to speak, and not worthy of intervening. That seems to have been the historic philosophy with much of this. And so the idea is that they have not been considered valuable, worth intervening. They have been identified as not the fitter of human species, and therefore shouldn't be survivable. There is no reason to even engage in a particular way, to leave them to their own demise, so to speak, and to focus more so on, again, protecting white agenda, white interests, white space, and what that means and looks like in the grand scheme of things. So I think it's consistent, even with those populations. I think that there is a way to have a conversation about them. For me, I talk about a lot of it, especially in this recent work, as community disorder. That encapsulates a lot of people. And I challenge the idea of even what disorder is. We follow, a lot of times we have problems with narratives and problems with theoretical ideas and philosophical approaches, but much of it is embedded in white supremacy ideology, and we don't challenge it. And so how do we even think about disorder? We've got entire things happening, even around the election, about law and order, and we've not challenged the idea. First off, what is order, and who gets to decide and determine it, and what does order mean? Like, what and how does that play out? Because some of these things are not even criminal, but they are packaged the same because we have followed along with these definitions, these superficial definitions for what order means and what that looks like across these very many populations and marginalized people holistically. So I think that, again, there is space to be inclusive. The movement is inclusive. I will say that the Black movement is inclusive. And it is, again, evolving. There is a collective. And in my experience, there have been space on the ground. In fact, many communities that had historically been left out and not received sort of highlighting, they embedded themselves and attached themselves to the movement on the ground for the sake of gaining access to mainstream media. Yeah. And so it is in that space, I think that we can continue to build and evolve, even in terms of other people who have been marginalized and left out of the discussion in some way.
I just want to make a quick note in the chat that I put in the Twitter handles for everyone on the panel, because I know we're about 2 minutes now, right to the end. And we could have gone on for hours, of course. I mean, I love my guests. I know them all personally. I'm just going to put it out there. So, and I can speak with all of them for hours. So, but definitely go to the chat if you want to follow up with them about anything. I'm sure they will respond to you and, give them a follow. This has been an excellent conversation. We certainly thank you for joining us here tonight. We've gone over a variety of different topics across the spectrum of justice, across the spectrum of social justice. And this panel is frankly our attempt to engage the public in cultivating deeply rich intellectual conversations about some of our society's most pressing issues. And it is also an attempt to bridge the gap between the university and the public in efforts of serving our student, faculty, and staff constituents, but also the broader community. And through these dialogues, we build new knowledges and innovative publics together. So as we depart, we encourage you to think deeply about the variety of topics that we discussed tonight. And we certainly hope that you go into November under the mighty power of empathy and understanding, so that we can become a more just and inclusive society. I'm thinking about all of the things we discussed tonight. Let's keep all of that in mind, even as we go to this 9 o'clock presidential debate. So please, everyone, vote, vote, vote. Make sure your neighbors are voting. Make sure your family members are voting. And of course, stay safe.
Thank you, Dr. Williams, for envisioning this conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. And everyone that attended as well. Thank you.
Yes. Yes. And the link will be available shortly after. So, you know, we have to upload it to YouTube, of course. So stay safe, everyone, and vote.